The chaos is hiding in what's irrelevant. And that's a very interesting observation, because since the chaos is virtually infinite, it's a real question. So where the hell do you put it? Well, you put it in what you ignore. And you can ignore it as long as it isn't actively interfering with your movement forward. You can assume that it doesn't matter. That it isn't matter. That it doesn't matter. Same thing. All right, so here's the kicker. There's one more class of things that you can run into along the way. And this is where the chaos breaks through. So let's say you're moving from point A to point B, and something that you don't expect occurs, and it gets in the way. So let's say that you're living with someone, and maybe you kind of like them. You're not married, so you don't like them that much, because otherwise you'd ask them to marry you. But anyways, and so a quarter of you is looking for something better, and 3/4 of you is half satisfied, something like that. And then the person, because we're ambivalent about such things, and then the person you discover, or the person announces that they've been having an affair. Okay, so then how are you supposed to respond emotionally to that? Well, the part of you that wasn't all that committed to the relationship is kind of exhilarated by that, and then the 3/4 of you that's half satisfied is hurt, and you're going to exploit that part for sure in the ensuing discussions, and not mention the, oh, that's kind of exciting that you've, betrayed me that way. But the point is that that's a hole. Now what's happened is you have this structure that you're walking on, like ice, like the thin ice that you're skating on, and now there's a hole in it. And the hole, we don't even know how deep the hole is, but you know there's a hole there, and so now you're anxious about it, although maybe also a little bit excited, because God only knows what's down there. But you don't know what to do with that hole, because it could spread very badly on you. It could be that the whole relationship was a facade, and that all your relationships have been facades, and that the reason that is because you're so damn shallow that it's impossible for you to have a relationship that isn't just a facade, and that's partly because you don't pay any attention to other people, and it's also partly because you're malevolent and selfish. So that's a nasty thing to discover. Or maybe that's the sort of person that you're attracting, which would make sense, actually, if that's the sort of person that you are. And so there are certain things that you can encounter that basically unglue you. And what happens is that those moments of being unglued travel up that entire hierarchy of presuppositions. It's like, because one of the logical conclusions to being betrayed in a relationship is that you're truly a bad person. Now, another equally logical conclusion is that the person that you're with is really a bad person, and another logical conclusion is all people are truly bad people. In macro ways and in micro ways, you can't trust anyone. You can't trust women, you can't trust men, you can't trust human beings, you can't trust yourself. The whole place is a catastrophe. It's a nightmare. Well, then you can fall through into chaos. Now, the way your body responds to that, or maybe, you're supposed to be getting a promotion at work. That's good. You're all chipper about the promotion at work, and you walk into your boss's office because he or she wants to see you, and they say, well, we've reviewed your performance over the last few years, and your performance has been somewhere between mediocre and decent, and we're downsizing, and see you later. That's not a raise or a promotion, that's for sure. That's a hole that you fall into. And the question is, well, what do you make of that? Right? How do you frame that? How do you take that emergent chaos and make habitable order out of it? You don't know. Is the whole capitalist system rotten to the core? That's a convenient explanation under those circumstances, that's for sure. Were you working for a psychopathic son of a bitch? Did you make the wrong choice in university, and was that your father's fault because you never did what you want, or was it your fault for not standing up to him? Or is it a dying industry, or is maybe this a wake-up call that you should go do something else that you've been waiting to do, that you've actually wanted to do your whole life, and that's why you're doing such a miserable job at your current occupation, because you're bitter and resentful about the fact that you never did what you want? You don't know. It's all of those things at once. And that's very stressful, because all of those things at once is too many things. And that's the reemergence of chaos. That's the flood That's the return to the beginning of the cosmos. That's another way that it's been represented mythologically. It's that you voyage all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos when there's nothing but undifferentiated chaos. And that's what you're confronting. And maybe it's too much for you. And often it is. I mean, that can be traumatizing. It can hurt your brain. You know, it's just too much for you to bear. But it doesn't matter. You're stuck with it. And so how do you respond to that? Well, some of it is catastrophic negative emotion. You freeze, and that's protective. And maybe you don't even want to move. You don't want to bloody well get out of bed for a week. And that's because your body is reacting as if the bedroom floor is covered with snakes, and the best thing for you to do is just not move. Just freeze. Not a pleasant situation to be in, because you're hyper aroused, very, very physiologically demanding, and there's zero about it that's productive, except maybe the snakes won't see you. But they've already seen you, so that isn't helping very well. So you've got all this undifferentiated negative emotion, anxiety, fear, hurt, anger, guilt, shame, emotional pain, the whole plethora of catastrophes. And then maybe on the other side, lurking down there is, thank God I'm done with that job. I just bloody well hate it. I drag myself off to work every day. And there's a little part of my soul that's so goddamn happy I finally got fired that I can hardly stand it. You know, and maybe you don't even admit that to yourself because, well, that would mean that all that time you spent at the job was just sunk cost. You're deluding yourself the whole time. It is an interesting thing to consider, though, sometimes if you're in the unpleasant circumstance of having to fire someone. You know, sometimes firing someone is the best thing that can happen to them, which doesn't mean that you should go out and, enjoy it. Although I have met very disagreeable people who actually enjoyed firing people. I'll tell you a story about that at some point because it's quite interesting. But, you know, sometimes if someone's just limping along in their job and doing it as miserably and wretchedly as they possibly can imagine, the best thing you can do to them, for them, is to say, you know, you're failing at this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have to be failing at absolutely everything else in the entire world. So maybe you should just accept the damn failure and go off and try something new. And I mean, that's terrifying for people, and I know they hate it and all that, but sometimes it's better than the alternative, which is just slow, torturous death.
The idea was there was something to dreams. And I suppose what Freud did is said, hey, look, isn't it strange? We have this whole other form of thought that we engage in at night, and it speaks in a language that we don't really understand. And so what the hell is that? And you can say, and many modern people do, dreams are of no significance, or even that they're random processes, which is an absurd proposition, obviously, because they're whatever they are, they're obviously not random. So Freud's idea was that there was something in dreams that was informative. So now he had a method for extracting out from the dream what the dream purported to represent. And he outlined that in great detail in The Interpretation of Dreams. And if you want to read one book by Freud, I would highly recommend that one. It's a very long book and it's very detailed, but Freud does an extraordinarily comprehensive analysis of the way that dreams work. Now he made because he had brought a theoretical framework to bear even on his investigation into dream structure, he concluded that dreams were essentially wish fulfillments. And that's where Jung and Freud disagreed. He also believed that the primary motivating factor of human beings was sexual. And now that's a tougher one to toss aside, because even if you're a Darwinian rather than a Freudian, you're going to obviously support the proposition that sexual motivation among any living creature is going to be one of the highest order motivations, because otherwise creatures don't reproduce and prevail over the long run. So the question is that the ultimate source of motivation? And in some sense, the answer to that has to be yes. Well, Freud wanted to make that in some ways the sole source of motivation. And I'm oversimplifying, and I hate to do that in relationship to Freud, because he was not a simple-minded character. Jung had a dream once, if I remember correctly, that Freud and Jung were excavating a basement. And so Freud had already discovered the basement, let's say, so that would be the unconscious structure of the psyche. And Jung broke through into another basement that was a multi-chambered place, so many, many, many rooms. And I suppose what drove Jung and Freud apart was Jung's proposition that there was a hell of a lot more going down going on down there than had already met the eye. And they broke on the idea that the sexual impulse was primary, roughly speaking. They broke when Jung wrote a book called Symbols of Transformation, which is actually, there's 3 books that I know of that are sort of like maps of meaning. One is Symbols of Transformation. One is a book by Eric Neumann called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And the third one, well, is Maps of Meaning. They're the same book. They're just like they're trying to solve the same problem from 3 different directions. They're all attempts to address the same problem. And so Symbols of Transformation was a book that Jung wrote about the fantasies of a schizophrenic American woman. And he was trying to relate her fantasies to these old mythological ideas. And Jung's idea, essentially, and this is an idea that was shared by people like Piaget, so we're not going to say that Jung or Freud just pulled this idea out of the air, was that the birthplace of mythology and literature, for that matter, was the dream. That they share structural, that they share what? Mode of information presentation. And it's a relatively radical hypothesis, but given that they both represent dreams and mythological representations share an essentially narrative structure, and they're literary like, I mean, it's not so unreasonable to notice that a dream at night is like the movie that you play in your head. And it's not unreasonable to note as well that the dreams that you have at night bear a relationship to the daydreams that you have during the day. It's a form of cognition. It seems like an involuntary form of cognition, though, and that's a very strange thing. So Jung thought about the dream as nature speaking of its own accord, roughly speaking. And so his idea was, well, when you sleep, you dream, but the dream happens to you. It's not something that you create the way that, and you don't even think about creating it. Because I might say, well, what are you thinking about? And you'll say, I'm thinking about whatever it is, and you'll take credit in some sense for thinking that because it seems like a voluntary activity. But what happens at night is that you think, but you think involuntarily. And so what Jung would say is that means that something is thinking in you. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And this is one of the things that's uncanny about the psychoanalysts, is they were willing to take their observations to their logical conclusion. There are things that think in you. What are those things? And what are they thinking? And why are they thinking it? Now, if you do dream analysis, and this is a tricky thing, because who's to say if your damn analysis is correct, right? It's very difficult to understand that. If you do dream analysis with someone, you generally have them lay out their dream. And then you ask them when they're going through their dream a second time, they lay out their dream and you can kind of get a picture of it. And then they lay out their dream a second time, and as they go through it, every time they mention a detail or a character, you ask them what that reminds them of. And the hypothesis is that the dream is presenting an image or an idea that's associated with a network of ideas, and that if you can expand on the network of ideas as you go through the dream, you can elaborate on the dream, you can expand it upwards, and you can start to see what it might be attempting to put forward. Now, Freud's idea was that the dream knew what it was doing, but that its content was being suppressed and oppressed by an internal censor. So the dream had to be sneaky about what it was saying because it was going to deliver a message that the person didn't want to hear. And that was tied up with his idea of repression. But that's not Jung's idea. See, Jung's idea was different. He said, no, the dream is trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you as clear as it can. That's just the best it can do. And so you could think of the dream, and this is, I believe, the right way to think about it. The dream is the birthplace of thought, the same way that artists are the birthplace of culture. It's exactly the same process. It's that your mind is groping outward to try to comprehend what it has not yet comprehended. And it does that first by trying to map it onto image. And it's doing that in the dream, and it's somewhat incoherent. And well, let's stick with incoherent, because it's not yet a full-fledged thought. It's the birthplace of thought. It's a fantasy about what might be. And then if you can grip the fantasy and share it with other people, then maybe they can elaborate upon it and bring it into being with more clarity than it would be if it merely existed as the precursor of a thought in your imagination.